Okay, let's talk about humans as beings made in the image of God. We read in Genesis 1 verse 26 that God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And then we have a little poem. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then God talks about food and some other things. So we have God speaking, let us make man in our image. Now, a couple of thoughts about that. Who is God referring to when he says, let us make man in our image? There have been many different suggestions. Some have said God is using the pluralis monarchis. He refers of himself in the plural like kings did, we have decided. Sometimes doctors do that still in the hospital today when they come and say, how are we feeling today? No, that's not exactly the same. In the Barnabas letter, the suggestion was God is speaking to Jesus. Augustine, Luther and Barth were suggesting that this is an early hint towards the Trinity. And another suggestion has been coming from Michael Heiser, who says that God was most probably referring to his divine counsel. I think in most evangelical circles people say it's the Trinity. The problem with that is that, first of all, Genesis and the Old Testament wants to make a very strong point against polytheism. So that's why we don't find open declarations anyway about a God that is three in one. Also, the recipients would have had no clue why it should refer to this. What people assumed anyway was a heavenly council that was part of the culture, that God had a heavenly staff team. You remember the host of heaven. And they were created before the humans. And in Job we hear that. I might come later, if we have the time, I will share some scriptures on that, when all the sons of God were rejoicing, the morning stars, when God created mankind. So it is actually quite likely that when God says, let us make man in our image, that he means his heavenly staff team and the heavenly rulers. Later on, God himself, alone, singular, he creates mankind. But what they share, and this is the point I also want to come to later, is they share in his rulership. And this is part of being made in the image of God. There have been lots and lots discussions. What does it mean? One thing is, when God says, us make man, that means the image of God or the image of rulership should not be alone. It shouldn't be single rulership, but it is community. And the image of God is only reflected in community. When God created things, he always said, it is good, it is good, it is good. And then there was a point when God says, it's not good. So what was not good? And God said, it is not good for man to be alone. And God changed it. And God split human up, and he made a community together with God. And I think this is a very important thing. Sometimes we discuss it. In some cultures, maybe there's a big discussion about men and women and who represents God and so on. God is represented by male and female. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So that's one aspect of what it means. But then the other one, there have been many discussions. What is it that distinguishes man from the animals and makes him an image of God? And people came up with language, it's the ability to speak. They said it's creativity. It were all kinds of things and attributes that are inside of man. The trouble is that as soon as man loses this attribute, he loses the ability to speak or anything like that, we could discuss if is he still made in the image of God, if he's in a coma. Is this an attribute, an ability or a skill that God has given to mankind? And when mankind loses that skill, then it's done. Or what is the immediate context? God says he made them in his image, and then he said they should rule. Let them rule. They should represent God as a ruler. How did God rule? What did we learn about God so far? Remember, this is the beginning of the story. What did God do? How did he rule? He ruled by dividing. He ruled by naming things. He ruled by giving order and function. And we will see later in chapter 2 that this is what Adam starts doing now. He's naming things. He's naming animals. And again, it's not just about giving them a name or a label, but with that he assigns them their place in creation. Alice Potter, a speaker you might hear, he says, man is a pattern breaker and a pattern maker. He says, to the wheat that is usually growing alongside the riverbed together with all kinds of other crops, he says, no, you should grow in this square, and corn you should grow here, and the rye should grow here, and he assigns orders and functions, and this is how he rules. And in that, he is an image bearer of God. When God says he creates an image, there are different words that are used for this. One word would be the Hebrew word demut, which means a similarity, something that is according to something else. There's also the word tselem, which comes from cutting actually. And it means it's a representation of the original. And it's also used for idols. It's a sculpture, it's a statue, it's an idol. Or it comes maybe from the word tsel, which means a shadow. It's a shadow representation or an idol or a statue representation of the original. So the image is about representation and rule. It's not an independent thing that we possess, but it is referring to the relationship that we have with our Creator, but also the function that we have in creation. So, to give order and function. Now, this is what is very, very interesting, and I'm quoting now a bit from Richard Middleton, who made a big study on this. And he said, when you look at the other creation accounts, but also how they were used and what they served, this whole creation account is really subversive. It's countercultural, it's actually revolutionary. First of all, in many other creation stories, let's start with our time. What the kings did in ancient kingdoms is they placed an image of themselves in remote parts of the empire to represent his authority. We read about this, for example, in the Daniel story, when this big image is made and everybody should bow down. And so in a sense, we still do that today. We have embassies, we have consulates, and so often when you go in, you have a picture or a painting of the king or the queen or the president. And then whoever is in there represents, functions as a representative of this king, of this person there. We may actually link the fact that God made representatives of himself or statues of himself in the garden with the law that prohibits us to make any visual representation. You remember in the Ten Commandments, you shall not make an image or an idol. Well, why? Because God has already provided such an image of himself. It is the worshipper. It's us. We are the images of God. So that's why we should not make anything. Because whatever we will do will not be a representation that is as good as we are already as living, breathing beings. Secondly, in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, the king himself was considered the image and representation of a god on earth. The Egyptian pharaoh was the son of God, he was called like that, but also all the other rulers. They had the commission from the gods to rule and to maintain the order on the earth, as the God did in the heavens. And that means when you read Genesis 1:27, that is revolutionary because it ascribes royalty to all humans, not just the king. And so the result is a big critique. In most of the other myths of creation that were distorted ideologies that were just there to justify the social system and the king's absolute power. He needed to rule because this is how the gods ruled. This was actually how the creation started. A common theme in other myths was that mankind was made to provide food for the gods, to provide for their needs. And that was also their justification for the temple system. The temple systems in other cultures existed to provide the gods with food. And the priests had the leading roles. And then later kings would often take the lead as the patrons of the temple. And so there was a strong royal power to a society where much of the land was under the direct control of the temple and the king. And then about a fourth of the population were working this land just as serfs. And of course, most of the food that was produced in these cultures went to the temple and palace personnel and of course not to the gods. But in Genesis 1 we see that nothing suggests that God needs or wants anything from what he creates. It's actually the opposite. God provides food for humans. God provides food for the animals. Something else is when we look at cities and technology. In the other creation myth and the stories that follow from that, the gods are the ones who act in history and they change the course of human affairs. They bring forth culture, they bring forth technology, they bring forth metalworking, agriculture and all these things. And the kings, again, are their representatives. But the vast majority of the humans, they were understood to live relatively predetermined lives of repetition, reduced to be puppets in a social order where they had no significant role, no significant freedom. And this is, again, a big change here. Humans should act, they should do things. Also, the big cities in other cultures were often had a story where the origin was connected to a divine act, like with Babylon and Marduk. And so that declared, of course, cities and their kings to be sacrosanct. You couldn't say anything against the city, against the system, because the God had appointed it to be. And in Genesis, and also later in Genesis 1 to 11, we see also stories about beginnings of culture, but the origin of both cities and inventions, if we look at it in Genesis 4 and 10 later, is human and not divine. Humans act in their God-given role. They exercise authority. They exercise dominion. The trouble is that later in the biblical story, we see how this tend to be linked with the abuse of power and then with violence. So it's kind of dominion gone wrong. People rule over other people in really, really bad ways. And then kingship, of course, you might have noticed already, kingship in other cultures was directly traced to the gods. And so the king was justified in what he did because he was a descendant or a son of the gods. And here again in Genesis we don't see anything like that. Even the genealogies that we have, in other cultures we have only genealogies of kings and royals. But in Genesis 5 we have a genealogy of very ordinary people. They are listed and they are not kings. Even when Israel turned into a monarchy, it was because of a human initiative. And actually we read that God was not very pleased about this. And then the king's power was also limited in his origin, in the duration. It was limited by the law of Yahweh and by prophetic criticism, because every human being represented God and exercised some kind of authority. Also, empire was demolished. In other cultures, empire was justified, the king, the city, and his rule, because the task of the king was to impose the order on brutal and barbaric other nations, but also the chaos forces that were outside. And the king did that exactly the same way that other gods did it. You remember the creation story when Marduk cuts Tiamat in half? It's very violent, it's very brutal, but that was the only way order could be maintained. And so, because the creation story was like that, the behavior of the king or ruler was justified. And we don't see that here. This Chaoskampf is a German term. This violent struggle is not there in Genesis. I mentioned that already. God is ruling and creating peacefully and lovingly. His words of commands are actually even loving words. They're more like an invitation. Let it be. It may be. You may come. Dinner is served. It's almost, this is the grammatic form that is used. God invites his creation to become and to be. And so the biblical image, the imago Dei, refers to this status or office of the human race as God's authorized stewards. And they are charged with this royal and priestly vocation of representing God's rule on earth by the exercising of cultural power, by ordering, by making things complex, by creating culture, by creating civilizations. And so the biblical writers, when they wrote Genesis, they did not just have an idea of a God that was different from their neighbors, but they had a different idea about what kind of social order was ordained by God, namely one that nurtured the flourishing of human life and all of this. Yes, I want to leave it here, and I want to end this part by watching a video from the Bible Project on the image of God. It's nothing new, but it's a very nice summary and representation of what we've already seen.
So if you lived in ancient Bible times, odds are you lived under the authority of a king.
And many of these kings claimed that they were gods, and they would even call themselves the image of God.
Meaning they had authority to tell people what to do, order things to be made.
Yeah, they got to define good and evil. And these kings would often make statues of themselves, which in Hebrew were called tselem, often translated as idol or image.
But for Israel, they didn't view their kings as the God. In fact, they were never supposed to even make images of God.
It's exactly right, and that was really unique for that time and culture. This is rooted, first of all, in Israel's belief that you can't reduce the creator God down to any one thing in creation. But there's another reason. People aren't to make images of God because God has already made images of himself.
When did he do that?
Well, let's go to page 1 of the Bible. And the first person we meet there is God. He's the one with authority over all creation. He speaks and creation obeys, and he defines what is good and not good. In other words, he alone is king. But then surprisingly, as the pinnacle of all of God's creative work, he makes humans, and he calls all of them the image of God.
So he gives all humans the authority to rule.
Exactly, that's what he goes on to say. He tells the humans to subdue the earth and to rule it. And so this task that once belonged only to elite kings is here in the Bible the task of every human being. This was a revolutionary statement in its day because all humans are being called to rule and to participate in the human project.
So what does this mean? I mean, how are we all supposed to rule?
So the picture we get in Genesis is gardening.
Gardening?
Yes. Gardening. So they rule the earth by cultivating it, by harnessing all of the earth's raw potential and then making something more and new out of it.
So growing food for each other.
Yes, but that also includes growing families then, which become neighborhoods, and then they create communities where people are going to work and take care of each other and build businesses and cities that will expand to new places and so on.
So ruling is really the day-to-day acts of our work and creativity.
Yes, we take the world somewhere. This is humanity's divine and sacred task.
Yeah, and this all sounds really nice. And humans have designed some pretty great things. But just as often we create things that cause a lot of suffering and a lot of injustice. So maybe we shouldn't actually be ruling.
Yeah, so the Bible addresses this. In Genesis, what happens is that God gives humans a choice about how they're going to rule. So are they going to use their authority for the benefit of others, which is God's definition of good, or are they going to turn away and define good and evil for themselves and use their authority for self-advantage?
And in the story, they choose to define good and evil on their own terms.
And so this is the Bible's depiction of the human condition. So sometimes we pull off amazingly good stuff, but just as often, despite our best intentions, we act selfishly and we create evil in the world.
And so we're stuck as mediocre rulers making a mess of things.
But that's not the end of the story. So the Bible goes on and it makes this claim that all of this was resolved when God bound himself to humanity through Jesus. And he showed us what it looks like to truly rule as a human.
So what does it look like?
Well, Jesus ruled by serving and by seeking the best for others, by putting himself underneath them and loving not just his friends, but also his enemies.
And that's not a typical way to rule.
And not only that, Jesus confronted the consequences of all of the evil and the death that we have created by our messed up ways of ruling. And he takes it. I mean, he lets it kill him. And so when the New Testament writers looked back to Jesus' resurrection, they see a whole new future opening up for all humanity.
Jesus is a new way to be human.
Yeah, that's why they called Jesus the image of God, or the new human. And not only that, they also believe that Jesus' divine life and power is now available to heal and to transform us to become our life and power.
And this sounds really nice, but what does it really look like?
So practically, the Apostle Paul said it looks like people being filled by Jesus' own presence and spirit, filled with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and integrity and gentleness and self-control. He says this is the new humanity that God wants to create in us so that we become people in whom God's image is being restored, people who will move the human project forward. And that's actually how the story of the Bible ends. It's a renewed world where God is on his throne and his servants are all around him, but they're the ones ruling over this new world, taking it into new, uncharted territory with Jesus as their healer and their guide.